I'm Craig Kelly with Or Group. Thank you for being here at Or Group Talks, our occasional sit down with people that we really enjoy and are excited about, and we think can contribute to a conversation that's going on in the field. Today, I think we're going to talk about something that really is big. I think in terms of what are we doing wrong as a sector that if we did better or we did different would sort of unlock a lot more potential. And I think this is a topic, how do we advance equity in philanthropy? That certainly is one of those keys. And I've been excited to see that conversation come to the front over the last couple of years, and super excited to be here with Alexander Young, someone who's been talking about this, leading on this, pushing on this for years. So I'm excited that she's going to join us in our conversation. ICE has really forged a career sort of across government, community organizing, nonprofits, philanthropy. She's always not, I wouldn't say put equity at the center, I'd say she put equity at the forefront in places sometimes that you could least expect it, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That's sort of how we first met. But she hasn't done it because it's morally right, though it is. She's actually done it because she's seen as like, that's the best way that we're going to get to success. I think that's sort of the key. ICE is the CEO of the Giving Gap, which exists to advance racial equity in giving and mobilize support of causes supporting Black lives. Formerly, ICE similarly advanced this kind of work in roles of the Meyer Foundation, Kaboom, the City of Charlotte, and Dream Defenders. Just to give you a couple of housekeeping things, hopefully you've been working from home for so long, you know where the bathrooms are located, so I don't need to give you those directions. But if you'd like to jump into the chat, you can do that. If you'd like to submit a question, I would ask at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you could put that there. The chat's good if you want to say hello to other folks. If you'd like to have any tech issues, just sort of do that over there. I won't be paying super close attention to that, so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I would encourage you to have questions. You're at the mercy of my curiosity up until the point that you submit questions. So I would try and do that if you can. But anyway, let's sort of jump over. I would say, you know, I first met Isa when she was at Kaboom. She was really focused on lifting the work there from one focused on single playgrounds to how do you change communities. It's pretty eye-opening for me. I mean, I certainly have a career dedicated to many many causes that advance equity, but I hadn't really sort of seen how pervasive inequity was. So I sort of had the realization of like, yeah, even where we put playgrounds and how we build playgrounds is contributing to sort of systemic problems that we're never going to solve unless we face into them. So since that time, I've really followed Ice's career with a lot of interest. I've often looked to her for things that her viewpoint, my background wouldn't allow me to sort of see things in the way that she was seeing them. That's been very helpful to me. She got a super active Twitter feed, which also keeps me entertained. But much of the work that she's doing at the Giving Gap, you know, really has come to the forefront, right? So I mean, if you think of over the last year, 2 years, everything that's sort of happened in the world, most notably the murder of George Floyd, has really sort of taken this idea of equity and sort of put it into the center of a lot of conversations where it hadn't previously existed. It's forced those of us that have done philanthropy for a long time to recognize, while we meant well, we've actually maybe not always done well. So it's just been a really great, a great time to be in this field and be able to recognize that we could do better and now hopefully start to do better. So I'm excited to get into these issues and more with Isa. So thank you very much for being with us. I'd say let's start sort of with an easy one. You know, your career, how did you get here? I don't think of many people, you know, who played, you know, nonprofit leader as a kid, but I get the sense from you that at a pretty young age, you knew you were going to want to change some things in this world. So I don't know, how did we get here?
It's funny that you say, Craig, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the great introduction. It's funny that you say that most kids did not play nonprofit leader. Looking back, I kind of did maybe. So, you know, I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina with my mother, who was very dedicated to a number of causes in the community. If you know anything about Charlotte, if anybody's ever been to Charlotte, Charlotte is a very segregated city. And we lived in a part of Charlotte so we could have better opportunities for a public education that's kind of more affluent, a wider, frankly, part of town. But most of our family and our social and our civic life was in Northwest Charlotte, which is the historically African-American part of the city. And so my mom spent a lot of time dedicated to organizations and people and causes in Northwest Charlotte. And I went every single place that she went. And so I really got kind of this civic education really early on. And there were also things about that that really kind of was frustrating to me. And when you travel from Southeast Charlotte to Northwest Charlotte, there is this, I'm sorry, my printer decided to make some noise. So when you travel from Southeast Charlotte to Northwest Charlotte, you go under this underpass. And when you go under this underpass is this both literal and metaphorical barrier that separates the Black side of town from opportunity, but then you also see the infrastructure start to decay. The sidewalks are different, the stores are different, the housing stock is different. And these are things that are systemic. I learned later on as I grew and learned in life that are systemic failures, not failures of the people that live on the other side of the bridge. Like there's no reason that an underpass should separate people from opportunity in the way that it does in that city. And so that is really kind of the orientation that I have and kind of the setting and what really drives me in my career and how I got to the work that I do. You know, the realization that a zip code should not determine opportunity, and a zip code should not determine the race of where people are able to live or who is able to live there. And that should not determine the things that they're able to do in their future. You shouldn't be able to predict a person's future by their zip code, but that's what we all do. You know, people in this world that are trying to solve issues or exasperating issues. We're using zip codes to determine things, and that should not be able to be a predictor. And I think that's the thing that's really driven my work and my career.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And it's again, it's one of those things you recognize, I think when you're young, sort of in an instinctual sort of way of like, oh no, I live over here, so these are my opportunities. And if you live over there, there's your opportunities. You're right, when you step back as you get older and recognize like, well, why the hell is that?
Right.
It sort of opens up a whole different set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
How about giving gap? For those not familiar, you know, sort of what does the organization do and how does it do it?
Sure, absolutely. So Giving Gap was founded in this very moment in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Our founders, our original founder, Christina Lewis, who is a high net worth individual, philanthropist herself, kind of noticed that, of course, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and also the COVID-19 pandemic, both, of course, disproportionately impacting Black communities, seeing people struggling with knowing where to give and saying, you know, these issues that are disproportionately impacting Black communities, other communities of color, we need to be, those of us who are able to give, we need to be supporting organizations that are led by Black people, founded by Black people that are on the ground in these communities and are able to have that cultural capital, that community capital, and are doing this very important work. And so it really just started with a list of Black founded nonprofits all over the country that, you know, grew into a list of over, you know, maybe 200 organizations, and was shared by hundreds of thousands of people who then went on to donate to these organizations. And at the same time, Christina and the other co-founders started to really learn more about the giving gap that exists for Black founded nonprofits and the fact that $400 billion goes to charity every single year, and a very small percentage of that goes to Black-led and Black-founded organizations. And I want to be really clear here that the imperative isn't that, you know, that money should be taken away from white-led organizations and redistributed necessarily to Black-led organizations. It's that we have an abundant society. And so there's no reason where if we have the ability to give in the 400s of billions every single year, that Black-led, Black-founded organizations should be systemically underfunded when they're doing tremendous work. And so we really became, Giving Gap exists to be able to, one, vet and catalog all Black-founded organizations that are doing a tremendous work across a range of a number of causes. They are all listed on our platform. They've been vetted. We found out where they're doing their work, how they're doing it. And then we exist so people can learn about those organizations, connect with them, and then ultimately give to those organizations with the intention of making sure that we're closing that gap that exists, making sure that they're getting the funding that they need and deserve, and ultimately that work is changing the outcomes for Black communities.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, it's interesting just to sort of step back, make sure we're all sort of speaking the same language and thinking about this the same way, right? I mean, this gap that you're talking about, right? I mean, I think of, yeah, I guess first sort of came to my attention when we were doing some work at New Profit. They started what was then called their Capitalizing Diverse Leaders and Organizations. And they sort of, I think, instinctively knew, but didn't have a lot of data to say, you know, hey, like, well, there's something going on here, and if you could fix it, good things would happen. Then Bridgespan and Echoing Green, so they did a big study where they actually started to quantify it and put some numbers and say, like, no, this is actually what this gap is, and you referenced it. And then you've seen, you know, New Profit's focus, you know, again, this fund on capitalizing leaders of color. Echoing Green is in the same thing, both really focused on social entrepreneurs in different stages. We've seen organizations like Public Allies that we work with sort of inserted a different point and sort of focus on leaders this way. But why does this challenge exist, do you think? Like, why was this gap created in the first place? How did we get here, maybe, is the question.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question and multi-layered, right? So the simplest answer is this because of the reason that every other resource gap that exists, you know, the wealth gap, the housing gap, that exists for Black communities and communities of color, like at its base, it has to do with systemic racism. When you think about the majority of Black founded nonprofits and how they started, particularly historically, can, you know, go all the way back to the first Black founded nonprofits that ever existed, they had to exist because they were filling a need that systems in our country denied historically Black communities and communities of color. So we had to create our own organizations to be able to fulfill basic society needs that were provided to other communities that were not provided to our own. I always tell people the first philanthropist I ever knew of was my grandfather, Romeo Alexander, who one of the things he did was led the building of the athletic fields at West Charlotte High School, which should have been funded by taxpayer dollars, but wasn't. And so it had to be funded by the community, right? And so at its base, this gap exists because we've had to create our own systems and institutions without the support of public dollars. And then it persists because once you start with such a significant gap, it continues to persist. But one of the things that we know here is, and this can be with the best of intentions, as we've talked about, Craig, that people are giving in their own circles, that giving is often relational. So you're not giving to the people and the institutions and organizations that you don't know of. And, we already have a segregated world and society and country. And so you're not familiar with these people and organizations. So you're giving to, people with capital are giving to the people that they already know and trust. And so it's this kind of cyclical, kind of insular, like in club with funding that exists. And I think the other things, that's both on the individual donor side and on the institutional giving side. And one of the things I worked in philanthropy for many years. And, again, often unintentionally, philanthropy has created these definitions and metrics that of what's effective, that really leaves out communities of color and doesn't consider things like cultural capital or relationships on the ground or shared experiences with the constituents that you're serving, and instead has kind of leaned in towards things that really can exclude communities of color. And so it's a number of compounding factors that cause this gap to exist and continue to persist.
Yeah, and I mean, we do a lot of work with social entrepreneurs, and I always thought, oh, how do you get into this? How do you start your organization? That kind of thing. And too often the things that jump out to me is like, the initial funding is, oh, my classmates in my MBA class at, University of Chicago, and that's one thing. And another is like, well, wait a minute, you kind of had the space and the privilege, I guess would be the way to call it, of like, you were able to kind of do this, like even,
Exactly.
yeah. So it sort of self-selects into a group of people that are going to be successful in this field, that are going to get kind of steamrolled from there.
Exactly.
But so when we look at that, if we can narrow that gap, right, if we can get more, or now let's go one step further, if we can eliminate that gap, if we can sort of get more, funding or equal funding to proximate leaders, proximate organizations, what's the change? Like, what's the opportunity there? What's the potential for the field, for the world, if we can actually fix this?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is frustrating, particularly for giving to Black-led, Black-founded organizations, and we've referenced it here, often giving to those organizations is motivated by tragedy or trauma, like the murder of George Floyd. So we see this kind of heightened interest in 2020, right? We see all of these commitments. We see individual donors jumping out from all over the place. And then we've seen that kind of wean off over the past couple of years. And it's not the first time this has happened. And so what happens, the impact to nonprofits, is you all of a sudden have this kind of rush of funding. You start to build up your infrastructure, you're developing your programming, you're seeing change. And then when all of that funding draws back because there's not that trauma motivated giving, then all the infrastructure that you have built has to go away. And then the impact on the community is, it's again this another trauma or tragedy that has happened, because you have these wonderful organizations that are achieving change in your community. The infrastructure, their infrastructure goes away, and then they have to slowly pull out. And then what resources that they were able to provide are no longer there. You have to understand, for Black communities and communities of color, that is a constant cycle of you're promised something and then it never comes to fruition, or it's taken away. So you're losing trust, you're losing hope. The things that you are promised, the promises are always broken. And so we really hope one change that will come is that giving and supporting Black founded nonprofits is not just motivated by trauma, because maybe some of these traumas and tragedies would not happen if we were fully funding these organizations. And then if we are fully funding these organizations, the impact of that is some of the systemic issues that exist start to crumble and fade away. And we are replacing them with the things that people need, the resources that people need to help close all of those other gaps that we talked about. And if we start closing all of those other gaps, then we don't have kind of the cyclical poverty, some of the other issues that we're facing in these communities. But if we keep on in this cycle of rush to invest because of a tragedy and then divest, then we're continuing the cycle of a lack of resources or resource deprivation that allows like 2 steps forward and then you slide back 20 steps. And we can never advance as a society as that. And it's important to note that I'm talking a lot about Black communities, but this is it's all of our community, and what happens in Black communities impacts every community. And we should want better for all of us.
Yeah, no doubt. Does it feel different this time? I mean, this idea of like, right, we kind of come these cycles of trauma, attention, philanthropy, and then it sort of comes down again. Does it feel different this time?
It does feel different this time. It absolutely feels different this time. And then sometimes it feels the same. But
Yeah,
it does feel
I agree.
different. It does feel different. I think the key thing that I see as different is beyond just kind of the public attention and promises and kind of the things that are more performative. I see organizations doing a work internally and having conversations internally that are a reflection of culture shifting. And so what we ultimately need and what the work that Giving Gap is trying to do is shift the culture of donors, shift the culture of philanthropy, and see what I see now where I haven't seen in other instances is there seems to be a change in the way people are thinking. And that is what is ultimately needed. You know, anybody can make a gift or a promise at any point in time, but have you changed the way that you're thinking about why you need to make that gift and how it needs to be sustained? And so I think that certainly feels different. But what I feel some level of caution around is again that sustained momentum. You know, issues that were created over 400 years are not going to be solved through a 1 year or 5 year, even 10-year commitment. So it's going to take sustained commitment. And I know a lot of times we as givers, as philanthropists, as people that work in this field, and everybody knows, you know, when you're working with funders, sometimes they want something, they want to see something right away. And I think there has to be a realization, again, we're not going to see some of these changes that we need to see right away and the way that makes you feel good immediately. Some of these things might be, you know, we're laying the groundwork for the next generation. And I think it requires a mindset shift there, to be willing to say, okay, we need to address immediate needs now, but we also need to kind of change the groundwater so that the next generation is not facing some of these issues in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's very much true, and I would agree. It does feel different having lived through some of these cycles as well. But like but you're right. Every now and again, you see a performative, tokenized sort of thing, and you're like, yeah, that's what we usually do. But I do think there is like this understanding of funding systems and thinking about systems and talking about systems that hopefully means we're going to take a longer view and stick with this and sort of actually see some change. To me, the most, I think, encouraging thing I've seen is I used to see like we would like to see, you know, a more diverse set of leaders leading organizations, as long as they think, talk, and act like us, right? So what I'm seeing now is there actually is a recognition of like, no, like that's actually the problem. Like it doesn't matter. Like we do need a broader set of approaches and mindset. Just a reminder, if you have questions, just you can pop them. There's a thing at the bottom. It's just Q&A. You can just click that. You can enter a question, and we'll get it over here, and I'll read it out. Sort of flip this issue just a little bit. As a leader of color, particularly a new CEO of color, you know, leading an organization focused on issues of race and equity, what kind of unique challenges do you face? There was just an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy that sort of highlighted a number of new leaders of color and sort of uniquely, you know, some of the things they're facing. But you know, what are you seeing, and is your experience as a relatively new CEO, and what are you observing in the field?
Yeah. So I'll say one of the things that I really face a challenge, and this is both a personal challenge and something that I receive and perceive, is kind of this idea of imposter syndrome, right? So this idea that I am not supposed to be here, I am not supposed to be a CEO, am I capable, can I be in these rooms? And absolutely, you know, the answer is yes, but I think the issue that a lot of leaders of color, CEOs of color face is that feeling of imposter syndrome, right? And that's not without warrant. It's because we've been in rooms so many times and have been treated like we don't belong there, don't deserve to be there, have been tokenized, are, treated badly in spaces. And so it's actually, it's PTSD that we have that makes us feel that way. So that is certainly a challenge. I also think that there's this tremendous pressure, and some of the article in the Chronicle touched on this, but there's this tremendous pressure now on leaders of color to, again, come in and like solve these things. Like, okay, well, you said you all should be here. Now you're here. We're giving you a shot. Like, come on, like get it together, fix everything that's broken in your 90-day plan, in your 100-day plan. How can you address the entire system, nonprofit system? And I think there's just this tremendous pressure that is very difficult to live up to. And I think it's also just a standard that has not been set for other leaders, particularly white male leaders, just being frank. And I think there's people that it almost feels like your people are waiting on you to not do well. Which is certainly, a challenge. And, we need board leadership and allies in the field who are going to lift us up in the rooms that we're not in, and that are going to get us in the rooms that we're not in, and validate us and support us, not in a way that's patronizing, but in a manner that says, like, this person and the work that they're doing is valuable, and be our validators in those spaces.
And I think, and this is the thing, I've seen a lot of studies on it too, even with like, female CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, that kind of thing. Like, I also think like we shouldn't emphasize that. It's like, oh yeah, they're great. Now we're going to be more open, and we're hiring different types of leaders, and isn't that fantastic? We're doing all of that in the context of the most difficult period of time, probably in history, to be a leader, right? You've got remote workers, you've got pandemics, you've got now war, right? Like, I mean, it's just like, oh yeah, great. Like, but how come you can't sort this out? You can't solve 400 years of problems in 90 days in the most difficult circumstances ever. Oh, well, I guess you're not cut out for this, right? Like, I mean, that's exactly. Just sort of a bogus concept for any new leader right now.
Exactly.
So when you think about this, like I tend to think of things almost like in terms of pipelines, right? So like, let's look at this a little bit differently, right? So generally the cycle is, right, major donors become board members hire CEOs hire fundraising staff find new major donors, right? So kind of like a big cycle. And my theory would be, like, if you stick, or historically have been huge numbers of white people in multiple of those places, that you're going to just kind of continue to sort of get people that look and think and talk and act like me, which probably isn't great. Leaders of any color sort of insert themselves in this cycle and change it, right? I think let's say table stakes, probably everybody on this call is like, yes, we want to change that. What advice, what things have you seen work to sort of start to change those cycles?
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about this. I think it's a really interesting and difficult question, in part because, I've been fortunate to, we were talking about one earlier, worked with James Siegel, Nikki Gorin. I've worked with a couple of, white CEOs who said to me, immediately, you need to be a CEO somewhere. Like, that is where you should be. And they were, willing to speak my name in places, and willing to make sure that I had the skills to really be able to grow into and take on a role like this. And so I think, to the question of inserting yourself, I don't feel like I should have to insert myself, right? Like, the work that I've done across my career should speak for itself. And the thing that I've been fortunate to have is white leaders and CEOs who had those relationships, had that privilege, who were not intimidated by my work or my presence at all, and instead, supported it, nurtured it, and said, you could be the CEO here, or you could go be the CEO someplace else, but that's what you should go and you should do. And I'm willing to, stick my neck out and make sure that that happens to you for you, because I believe in you and I believe that you could advance a mission. And so, in that way, instead of how we kind of insert ourselves, I think there's a big part for allyship here, and for white leaders to not be intimidated by this moment, and instead be like willing to, support your colleagues and of color, and the folks that you see coming up that really have great and tremendous potential to be leaders, and making sure that, they're meeting with the big funders. So when they go on to their next venture, they're able to take those relationships with them, and put them in spaces where, in rooms that they typically wouldn't be invited in. James and Nikki did that for me. And I know that doesn't happen for other people. I know in some ways, inserting yourself, and this is a risk, I have always led with racial equity, and have been fortunate enough, again, to have found leaders and worked for leaders who appreciated that, and have been fortunate enough to had people that thought that that was of value, and it wasn't a distraction, or it wasn't that I wasn't trying to cause trouble, right? And so I think, if anything, around inserting yourself, if there's ever been a moment where a Black leader, a woman leader, a leader of color can come and say, like, equity is important, the knowledge, the firsthand knowledge and experience I have around this is important, and is something that needs to be in the room, now is the perfect time to speak up and kind of assert that as a skill and a leadership competency, whereas before it hasn't been considered that way.
Yeah, very helpful. And I think of this as someone who wants to be an ally, and just sort of digress for a second, right? Like, I had taken the view over the last sort of year and a half or so, as a lot of this is playing out, I don't need to be the leader on everything, right? Like, I don't need to be the voice on anything. Like, I know what I'm supportive of this, but like, I've got, somebody else could lead on this. And then I remember one of my first jobs was working at a summer camp, and it's a whole long story about people drinking when they weren't supposed to, and blah, blah, blah. But our camp director eventually then said to me, and it sort of recently has been echoing in my head, is, you don't get to choose. If you're a leader, you don't get to choose when you're leading, right? Like, you can't choose if you lead and don't lead on. And my thinking I was letting other people lead was actually sending a message that it wasn't important to me, which wasn't the message I was intending to say. It wasn't the message I was intending to send. So yeah, I think you're right. For anybody who's out there, if you're a leader and this is important to you, you can't just sort of sit idly by. You have to give voice to it. You have to actually give people opportunities. And to do anything less, then don't look in the mirror and pretend you're an ally, because you're not, right? Like, you have to actually step forward and sort of and speak up and do things actively. A couple questions coming in on the chat here that let me just sort of pull some. This one is sort of along the lines of where we are now. Like, how do you challenge other people in the room that listening can't come just from you, and change their views, their beliefs, views, prejudice in order to have change? So I guess, yeah, how do you sort of, I don't know, how have you effectively done that? How have you challenged others that, they need to be part of this solution, and not just sort of sit back as maybe I was doing and let others solve it?
Yeah. So I think it's all about values, and getting back to values-based leadership. I think in many ways, the people that don't care about racial equity and racial justice, if you can get them into, like, what are your values at the root, you can draw quite often a correlation between whatever they say their value is to why there's a need for racial equity and racial justice. And when I came on board at Meyer Foundation, Meyer was doing some work to center racial equity, and in working with that board, there was a lot of questions, maybe some resistance, and it all came back to, let's talk often and frequently about values. and drawing a correlation. Again, you can't believe in freedom and justice for all and not care about racial equity. And if you have a deep conversation with people about what their core values are, I promise you, unless the person is just, Lex Luthor and just evil at the core, that you draw that correlation back to why there's a racial equity and a racial justice imperative. It won't happen for everybody. And sometimes there's going to be turnover if you're trying to push that way. And sometimes that turnover is just positive. I made a decision some time ago that there are enough of us that believe in this work. And you can try with people and try to bring people over, and you bring those people over, and then work with all of us that do, because there are enough of us. And then the others will be swayed by seeing this work in action. So I think you can spin your wheels trying to convince people that aren't there, but I think it's better time spent to organize the people who are and continue to bring them along, and the others will come as they do.
Okay. Another one from the audience, my friend Ruth Brown. Great comments. Basically, she asked, government has a bigger role to play. How do those of us in philanthropy advance public policy with a racial justice lens? Have you seen it happen? Where does it happen? Where does it happen? Ruth is always thinking bigger and bigger than I am, so I'm not surprised she's pushed that way. Where does government fit into all this? Do you think?
Yeah. None of this really happens without, it's a systems problem. It has to be solved through systems, right? And so I think one thing that philanthropy needs to do that it doesn't do enough of is provide general operating grants to organizations that are doing systems change work. It's not the work that foundations like to fund often because, as we were talking about earlier, it doesn't give you like kind of those good widgets to count that makes your board feel good right away. I did a lot of work at Myriad Foundation to actually help create metrics that could measure social change, like indicators of a shift coming, knowing that, the shift may not come, the quantifiable shift may not come till later, but here are the conditions that are changing that we can really measure right now that let us know that that shift is coming. So I think, yes, the first thing that philanthropy must do is be willing to fund those organizations with general operating dollars, which is really important because they need to be able to shift with the context. So when you have project dollars, you can't do that. So funding those organizations, and then particularly locally, there's a lot of national funders, but we're talking about more local or regional funders, being really engaged as a convener to help have those conversations where you can have influence around what systems change needs to happen, what work needs to be done. I think local philanthropy in particular really kind of neglects its not just responsibility, but ability to be a convener and get people in rooms that would never, usually be together, and to be able to kind of stoke conversations that wouldn't normally happen.
Helpful. One more from the audience for the time being, because it sort of fits there. The question is, do you think is it better to commit longer term funding to one organization, or to sort of fund sort of multiple organizations on maybe a shorter term or shorter basis?
Yeah. So I guess if it has to be either or, right. I don't think it has to be either or.
Yes, right, do both.
Do both, but I think it is much more important to do longer term funding. I like big multi-year unrestricted grants. I think are the best way. But one of the things I think is important to ask grantee partners is, who are their allies? who is doing, critical work that makes their work better, or that they, look to support the work that they're doing or help them shift the system. And if a philanthropic organization is kind of able to map out the constellation of organizations that are working together and saying, okay, we're going to support the entire constellation because we think group A is really important and their work is dependent on group B. So they both need a large unrestricted grant, and then they get even further together. So I think it's really important to, again, like, ask about your organizations that you're funding, ask who their critical allies are, so you're able to support that entire constellation of organizations.
That's a very point, and I'm not seeing funders do that very often, right? Like that's interesting, right? Like most nonprofits are interconnected, and yeah, that's a great idea. I love that. So to go in sideways off that a little bit, as a sector, do we tend to raise money in a way that sort of advances or causes or creates more white dominant culture? Like are we raising money in a way that is excluding people from giving, and sort of keeping the status quo the way it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes, we are. I think, again, going back to kind of this idea of how we define what's effective, not being willing to take risks on organizations that don't have the dollars, from day one, don't have the infrastructure from day one. We talk a lot about, capacity building for organizations, and which is true. Organizations do need capacity building, but what they need often, even more so than that, is infrastructure support. Like, they just don't have the infrastructure. And just being fully transparent, it's been fascinating for me to be the founding CEO of Giving Gap, that was founded by, people that have resources and wealth. And so when I stepped into this position, we were able to have pro bono legal support, pro bono PR support from one of the premier firms in the world. I'm able to walk into rooms with funders where I maybe typically wouldn't have access. And it's, just being honest, it's due to like the wealth privilege that exists in, my founders. And that's why I'm able to be taken seriously when I first step in the room. Now, when I get in the room, I have to make it, make it be seen seriously. But if we are kind of rewarding the same organizations over and over again, because of some of the privileges that they have, we're leaving out so much of the sector. And I think, the strategies that exist just do not allow for organizations, the founders that don't step in with that level of privilege, to participate, to have access. I hate questions about sustainability. How are you going to fund this work next year? We're going to ask you for more money. We're a nonprofit, and you have the resources.
What do you think we're going to do? Right.
Yeah. So I think there are things that we should be doing to lend more infrastructure to smaller Black and other people of color led organizations. At Meyer, we hired development staff to be shared across a number of the Black led organizations. So because oftentimes they don't have that infrastructure, and those gaps, it's just a continuous cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I very much so. And it's a little bit like the shoe salesman telling you need new shoes. But like you see so many organizations, like if you can't invest in fundraisers, like how do you expect that you're going to continue to raise money? It's like kind of a silly thing. Let me take another one from the audience here. What do you see as sort of top funding priorities that philanthropy should pursue to close the racial wealth gap and narrow socioeconomic disparities? So aside from supporting organizations with leaders of color, that's one thing that we've discussed in the benefits there. Are there specific causes too that you see that you try and steer philanthropists towards?
Yeah. So I think again, it's really important, and it doesn't give you that maybe right away immediate feeling, but it's really important to support organizations that are doing systems change work, because it doesn't, it makes an impact in the immediate if you have an organization that is teaching financial literacy, but you can't teach financial literacy and there's no finances
Right.
to to couple it. And so I know that we all kind of like those organizations that are able to say, we trained 100 families in financial literacy. I'm not saying don't fund those organizations because they're not important. I'm saying that if you don't couple that with funding organizations that are doing change at the systems level to make sure that there's finances that go along with the financial literacy, then we're never going to change that gap. And so I think to be able to really take a deeper look at organizations, and they can be kind of, they're scarier for philanthropy and givers, right? Because there's not as much structure. They have to be able to like move and be responsive. They can't tell you, what the next 2 years is going to look like exactly. And if they did, it'll change, and they're probably not, they're forcing themselves to give you an answer. So it's kind of the willingness to go with that and take that risk so that you're doing work that is, you're supporting work that is fundamentally looking at the systems that exist. Because as someone mentioned and asked earlier, if there are not changes at the systems level, none of these gaps will ever close.
And we do a lot of that sort of work. And I think one of the things that I find is amongst the challenges is like this idea of like even explaining that work, right? Like it's easy to say, oh, I don't know, give me $100 and I'm going to give, out 10 meals, right? Like it's harder to say, give me $100 and I'm going to deal with this root issue that's been going on for 400 years. You may not see any difference, but like it just,
Yeah.
They tend to answer in paragraphs, and sadly we're still in a society that likes its answers in, sort of sentences, right? But like it's a paragraph to explain system change. But yeah, I agree. That's where the most difference is. What's the most exciting thing you're seeing in philanthropy at the moment?
I'll relate this maybe to the most exciting thing, but going back to that previous question, I think one of the ways to kind of answer that is that the work around doing systems change work is ultimately about building power in communities that haven't had it. And that work is extremely important. So there has been 1% of the population that has all of the power and is making decisions for communities that they've never stepped into. And so ultimately, a lot of organizations that are doing systems change work are building power in communities, so that those communities can have a say in their future and the future of this country and what things look like. And so being able to say people are developing the authority to change their own conditions and the conditions of their community and the conditions of their state and the conditions of the world and their country, I think is the most powerful work that is being done out there, and is work that needs to be supported. And so to connect with that around what's exciting, I do think it's exciting to see funders supporting more power building work that is resulting in people being active in their communities and having a say and showing up and understanding. I think we're also at this place for a number of reasons where the everyday person is understanding a lot more about systems and what impacts all of the things in their lives. And so being able to see that work getting more support and gaining kind of leverage, I think is really exciting and important. Maybe not so riveting and exciting to others, but exciting to me, particularly over the past couple of years. I think like leaders of color or people that are doing organizing work or voting rights work, those people are tired. Like it has been a long 5 years. And so I have been seeing funders fund those people taking a break getting some rest. I've seen everything from like a weekend away to like month-long sabbaticals that also help the organization develop, sustainability and transition planning. Like, okay, what if our CEO does leave? What does it look like? How do we step in developing that planning while the person is gone? And so I know that people are like, rest, like, why would you fund that? That has nothing to do with the work, but people are so drained. We're all so drained, but particularly people that have the entire pandemic been like outside doing organizing and community work and fighting sometimes what seems like insurmountable systems, but getting up and doing it again the next day. Those people need a break, and it is very much connected to the work, because rest and restoration is the only way that they're going to be able to come back, fresh to keep on doing it. And those folks deserve a break. I think it's really exciting to see funders and philanthropy embracing the idea of rest as like a fundable activity.
That's amazing. I love that. I have not seen it, but I can't wait to see it. And I'm glad that it's out there, because I mean, I don't know. I talk to a computer screen and make PowerPoint presentations for a living, and I'm exhausted. So I can only imagine people that are out there really doing this work, how exhausting it is. What's next for Giving Gap? Where do y'all go from here?
Yeah. So Giving Gap we have over 800 organizations vetted and listed on our platform. We've had over 30,000 donors on our platform, and over $1 million transferred directly into Black founded nonprofits and communities. And so what's next for us is continuing to shift the culture of philanthropy and saying that it's an imperative that we see a shift in donor and philanthropic culture to close the giving gap, to ultimately change the way that Black communities and communities of color are supported. And so we want to make sure we are looking to raise $1 billion for Black founded organizations. We want to have 1 million people participate in this work. And it's always really important for me to say that 1 million people, again, is really important for me. So if Mackenzie Scott calls me tomorrow and says, Aisha, have your $1 billion, I will take it, and we will make sure that it gets across every single organization in the platform. But then I'll still be looking for 999,999 folks, because that number of people is an indicator, again, of that cultural shift, which is ultimately what we need to close the giving gap in this country.
No, I've always said, I'm like, the actual going out and raising money is about dollars, but it's also about support, right? Like, if you can't align support around your organization for some mass of people, then you should examine what you're doing, right? Because that's like the measure of like, all right, am I convincing people that this is important?
Exactly.
All right, we're coming up on time, but what will be one piece of advice you give to sort of leaders that want to be change makers? I've always admired you as someone who drives change. What advice would you give to folks out there?
Yeah, I think change work is exhausting. So my advice is to take a break when you need to and come back refreshed, but don't stop, because it's extremely important. It's the only way that all of the issues that we all care about and think are important, if we're not thinking about them through an intersectional lens, we're not going to be able to address them in any form or fashion. And so I think it's just extremely important that people get the rest that they need to come back and keep pushing, keep your foot on the gas. We're making so much progress right now that we need an ally in every room, a person in every room that's building those coalitions and pushing the gas on these issues.
Excellent. Thank you. I would say someone who's put in the chat that you have a, what do they call it? A fantastic energy, which I think is the exact best way to describe it. So thank you for being with us today. More importantly, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for knowingly or unknowingly letting me feed off some of your fantastic energy regularly, and it's a privilege to kind of be in the outskirts of your world, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you everybody for being here today. I would say coming up next on, let's give you the right date here, and I we'll ask and then they'll get yelled at later. I didn't write down the date, so it's fantastic. I think March 8th, I want to say, is our next org group talks. Our managing partner and co-founder, Steve Bohr, is going to sit down with Gene Case. They're going to be talking about ESG
I love
sort of
Gene.
writ large and how it relates to philanthropy, and I'm sure lots of other good topics as the world around us spins. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers with everybody in Ukraine at the moment. Everybody out there, keep working hard and doing what you're doing. Thanks for being with us, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. This
Take
is
care.
great.
Bye.